Okay, so now we'll get into the data, what you came here for. I just wanted to sort of bake this, and now it's ready to take out of the oven, okay? So thoughts, questions, anything? Okay, here we go. All right, since 2008, we at Herman Miller have been measuring and monitoring space in terms of seat utilization. There are many, there are many different organizations that use other ways to sort of figure out these numbers. And that's fine, no judgment. I'm just showing you our research in terms of the collection of data, okay? So you know sort of where this is coming from. And I'll get into what this all means in a second. So we have measured, actually we finished ESPN a little while ago, so we're at 25,000 seats. I have some other ones happening otherwise. So we're well over 25,000 seats right now that we have studied. The average study, so I'm showing you the back research into this, right? The average study is around 300. We've done a small study, 34. That really doesn't help unless it's a very small firm or organization. To as many as over, I believe now the most that we've done is 2,500. I actually did that one in Houston, worked all night and put little moats under chairs. And so I'll talk about what all of that means in a second. So this is where the research is coming from, and I want you to understand that it is continuously being refreshed, all right? So this is not old data, it is collected and continues over time. So this is where we're getting at, all right? So what happens is, in terms of how this research was created, there are these little moats, I call them accelerometers, but they're little moats, that have a little sticky adhesive, Velcro to them, and you place them underneath chairs. Now, it's great if they're Herman Miller chairs, but they don't have to be. As long as there's some sort of wiggle room, as long as there's some sort of motion, we can determine its utilization. Now, we're working in lounge seating as well. We're kind of testing that out right now. It worked in Houston. It's working in Seattle right now. So that's sort of what we're thinking about. But best case scenario is something with wiggle room to it. So things with casters. So conference chairs, private office chairs, the desk chair, or side chairs if they have casters on them, workstation seating, those sorts of things, okay? Now, I want to be very clear about this. We are not measuring whether or not Bob or Kathy are being productive at their desk, okay? We cannot determine whether or not Bob or Kathy are on Facebook or reading the latest and greatest spy novel. None of that, okay? That is not what this is doing. So if you're wanting to find more about productivity in terms of this utilization, we are not that sort of organization, okay? We are not putting RFID tags on people. We're not putting up cameras. We're not having individuals punch in codes. None of that sort of stuff, all right? It is very unobtrusive. It's actually a philosophical difference. I personally don't want workers to have to do this. I want them to be focused on their work. So that's sort of where we're coming from. And you may want to get other sorts of data, and that's definitely fine. I'm just showing you sort of where we're coming from in our discussion, all right? So this is what we know, and our goal is to understand the utilization of the seat, which links, in our opinion, to the space, okay? So the measuring the utilization of the chair and how often that is being utilized over time. It happens during a 3-week study. 1 week does not give us good data. 8 weeks is honestly no better than 3, okay? And this happens between an 8 a.m. and 6 p.m. time period generally, but it's based on the customer, okay? It's never done during a holiday time. It's never done on the weekend if the client isn't there on the weekends. It's all only done, right, during the time when people are actually there doing their work. And during holiday does not give us good results, right, because people are on vacation. And you want it to be built on, you know, a good amount of facts and reality, of course. So that's what's happening here, okay, in terms of the measurement and the monitoring of the space in regards to the seat itself, okay? Yes? All right. So what we are able to provide through our data scientist folks to the client are these, and I know you can't see this, it doesn't matter though, but what you're able to see are with the client are lots of different pieces of how the data can be sliced and diced based on days, hours, departments, however they want it sort of measured. That's what they're seeing, okay? Providing that background. So this is the point in time when folks are either in disbelief, shock and awe happens, or they're clapping or something, right? There's some sort of emotion either way when we get to this slide in the room, because I'm always around people, you know, one believer and then everyone else is those other folks that are in disbelief. So here's what we have found through all of this kind of knowledge, right? 80% of the time, private offices go unused. Okay? 60% of the time, workstations go unused. And 50% of the time, conference rooms go unused. And when they are used, only half the seats are being filled. Okay? So real deal, no joke, data across the board. Organizations then begin to argue, my organization is different. That's fine, and I'm going to get into that in a second. But this is the data overall that we have collected. And again, it's based on the utilization of that chair within that space. Okay? Not cameras, not RFID tags, not someone typing in. It's not the room monitor situation, right? Or the conference room check-in, because sometimes you know this, although I'm sure you never have done this. You check out a conference room and then you're not able to use it for whatever reason. So that is not good methodology, in my opinion, just personally, to determine if the space is actually being used. One way to determine that is whether or not people are actually sitting in the chair, okay? So sometimes I'm going to sort of think about questions that you might ask. Sometimes people will say, how do they respond when you tell them that this is happening, right? That there's a sensor on their chair. Robert, might you ask that question maybe? No? No? Okay. Let's say someone else will ask that. Oh. Okay. So the process is very transparent. We do not engage with a client that is not going to tell their employees that this study is happening. That's another sort of philosophical sort of thing for us, okay? So they have to know, everybody who's using the space, who may be potential users of that seat, has to know what's going on. And we provide boilerplate communication, all of that sort of good stuff in terms of what's happening. So I want to make that very clear. Everybody knows what's happening. And the idea is that we're not measuring, again, someone's productivity. We're measuring the real estate utilization based on the seat, okay? So that's what happens. Very transparent process. So, so we show these numbers. We understand that it could be different based on various industry. That's fine. But then we'll sort of get into some thoughts about that, and I'll show you this information. So in general, other things that we find is that rooms with technology, conference rooms, meeting rooms with technology, are 5 times more likely to be used than rooms without technology. And in general, through both the quantitative and the qualitative research for us is built on focus groups, surveys, observational ethnography, all that sort of good stuff. We find that people tend to clamor for smaller meeting room spaces, which our A&D friends, you know, you already know this, and I'll give you data to sort of back that up in the conversation, okay? So here is a real client. This is a real client, and I'm providing their real numbers for you today, okay? So I won't share who the client is. I'm just sort of telling you this is what it is. I don't want to get caught into the weeds of how they came about with this particular number, the cost of their real estate. This is their own number. We did not determine this. They provided this number based on their real estate, if it's leased or if it's owned, all of that sort of stuff. And they put into this dollar amount whatever they wanted to factor this in, all right? So this is their number. What we provided was the utilization of their workstations, private offices, and conference rooms. So you can see their utilization average of workstations was 40%. Their private office utilization was at 23%. So I told you it might, you know, the average might fluctuate a bit, and you can see that it did here for them. So you see this information here. Now the client can determine the cost of the cost of each space, however they determine it, their numbers, not ours, okay, their numbers. What I want us to look at here are these numbers in red. So what they're saying, what this client is saying, is that if 40% of the seats are being used, if the utilization is 40%, 60% of the time their workstation is not being utilized, they equate this to a specific dollar amount that they have put together, they're real estate people, okay? And they determine that that cost being underutilized in terms of, this is the harvest part, okay, is $7.79 million. For private offices, 3.95. For conference rooms, 2.2. So 7, 3, 10, 11, 12, $13 million here is what this customer, the real estate folks for this customer put together that was being under or not utilized, okay? So we can argue whether or not these real numbers should be $13 million, $7 million, $2 million. We can have that discussion all day, okay? But the thought is, at what point in the conversation, how many millions of dollars does it take to make a compelling case to do something about this number? That's the concern for the client, right? In terms of whatever resonates with them. We are not saying at any point in time that you need to give up 60% of that real estate, right? Or 40 or 77%. That's not logical, right? You want to understand not just the quantitative data, but the qualitative data. Why are they not using that space? What else are they doing? So we're not saying to harvest all of that, okay, but how much do you want to harvest? And then reinvest it, so from a dollar standpoint, then reinvest it into something else, okay, based on whatever the critical needs are of your organization. I am not again saying that they need to reinvest that into tables and chairs or even into real estate. It could be something, if they're a product organization, maybe they're going to put this money into R&D or another service offering that they might be able to provide. The thought process, again, is for them to determine the cost of that utilization, lack of utilization, to help them build this compelling case. Are we okay with that? Does that make sense? Yes, sir.
Do you see much of a variance in terms of utilization by manufacturing versus service versus
You are on my next slide, Al. You are on my next slide. Good. Okay, so the question was, do we see utilization difference based on industry? And someone always asks that, and so I have that slide. So I've sort of prepared for the likely realities of questions that might be happening here. So I'll have another example of another real client with numbers sort of at the end of all of this, but I'm starting again with the end in mind. This is the compelling case, hopefully, that we're discussing. All right? So this is another real client, and although they have wonderful names for their conference room, like Aspen and Vail and Keystone and Breckenridge, they still did not have excellent utilization of their conference rooms. So utilization is, in the Aspen conference room, 3% utilization, Vail 18% utilization, Keystone 25% utilization, and that's even with a good amount of technology in the room, right? So even though we say these things 5 times more likely to be used in the conference room when you have technology, it's not going to be the same for every client. That's certainly fine, but the best result is sort of testing it on your own, testing your own sort of physical space. Okay, to Al's question, and I know government is misspelled, I didn't put this slide together. So, think about this. In the history of doing our research, all right, what we have found, every organization will say that they're very unique, but at the end of the day, the average number of folks in a conference room are 3 to 4 people. The average number of people that use a conference room are between 3 and 4. It doesn't matter what industry you're in. Doesn't matter, doesn't matter, doesn't matter. It's 3 to 4. Now, will there be a time when you need to have 15 people in a conference room? Yes, of course. Will there be a time when you may need to have 20? Yes, that's fine. But are we building based on that one time a quarter, or are we building on what's happening every hour, right? So this is just data that you can sort of take from this conversation. You can also see here utilization within industry of conference rooms. So when I had my GSA presentation, I showed them conference room utilization at 40%. Research pharmaceutical at 37% space here. Business services also include professional services as well. That's at 60%. You have IT or technology. Their conference room space is at 51%. But if you take a look here, financial services, goodness gracious, 21% utilization of their conference rooms. Okay, just what we've seen with our customers since 2008. It's just that, you know, it's not every single financial services organization in the country, right? Because we haven't measured all of them. It's just sort of showing you where we are with the numbers, okay? So just keep sort of that in mind. The other thing that I want to show you here is utilization based on vertical market. So services here, these represent your business and professional services. The red bar indicates utilization. The red bar indicates utilization of workstations. The gray bar indicates utilization of private offices. Okay? So here we go. Financial services are the ones that are constantly clamoring. Insurance and financial services are always the ones that are clamoring for their private offices. Always, always, always. We have to have our private offices. Utilization of those private offices, 14%. 14%, okay? Another, energy is also a favorite of mine, being in my neck of the woods. 23% utilization for private offices, and they love their wood private offices, wood-lined private offices, 23%. Real deal situation, customer energy company in Houston, the only reason why they were moving out of private offices is because they had an attraction retention, they had a knowledge sharing problem. New folks were coming into their space. Veterans would go into their private office immediately and close the door. And so the new folks were not able to kind of get an understanding of how the organization works. And so the only reason why the organization was moving outside of private offices is because they felt like if they didn't do something in the next 5 to 10 years, there would be no one who knew anything about their organization because all of those folks in the private offices would be retired. Honest story. And so the case for those folks that were a bit grumpy and hostile was because they weren't going to exist. I mean, that's how they felt. And so they came to us and had this conversation because of the knowledge sharing sort of issue in this. So these are just sort of the discussion around manufacturing. You can see private office utilization 16%, workstation utilization at 36%. So this is just some of that information. I have some information built on law firms. Some of our research is in different industry is not statistically relevant, meaning I don't have enough data. I have a couple of thousand seats in Canada, but I can't make a reference in terms of, you know, in Canada, how often are people utilizing their space or not. So that's just one example, but we can show you from what this looks like in terms of utilization. Okay, now many times, yes ma'am, sorry, go ahead, no ma'am, no, fine, certainly.
Have you done research in Europe, and how does that juxtaposition to the U.S.?
Europe, the question was around utilization in Europe. We've done space, I actually have something that is about to happen in London with 800 seats. The bulk of our study is in North America, the bulk being, of course, in the US. We have sample work in Europe and in India. At this point, I don't feel like it's statistically relevant to share as fact. I can just share it as insight, which would be in sort of a discussion about all of that. So I can do that at another time for you to provide through your, you're here. Yes. They are, but I don't provide it as a fact yet because I don't have enough stuff on it. Okay? Yes, ma'am.
What about regional within the U.S.?
So this is what generally also happens. We'll ask about regional influences. It is less compelling. That data is more compelling built on their industry. Many times the argument, folks that are not yet on board, and this actually was a true story. Grocery store chains, family owned in the northeast section of the country. That's what they wanted, right? So at this point in time, it was no longer an argument about reality. It was just sort of find someone exactly like us and see what they do. Well, we need to base this data based on our own sort of work, not necessarily, you know, the next door neighbor or what's happening here. So what we found is that it's really the industry, less about the region, that's more compelling in terms of what's happening. Okay, so so the next part of the conversation is around any other questions? Anything else? Okay, the next part of the conversation is many times people are in great disbelief in terms of how often they utilize their space. And so these are 5 real clients, and we've asked them, the gray bar indicates how often they told us through survey work they use their space. I like picking on client number 2. They tell us that they use their space 86% utilization. That's high. That is very high, quite honestly. 86% utilization. So this is not my goal, 70%. It's just a goal to think about. And a real estate person should think about, of course, what their real estate optimum is in terms of utilization. Okay, so let's just say it's 70%. 100% is not appropriate. Yes?
I understand that you've been doing this since 2008, but when you go to a certain business and you put them out there, is that over the range of 1 year or what kind of timeline?
These specifically that I'm showing are based off of the last 2 years. So our early work, and I'm refreshing this sort of constantly in the discussion. And these are across industry. So this particular slide is not reflective of only the tech industry. The point of this slide is to help us oh, I'm sorry, the question was around how fresh is the data, and is this a particular...
You've been doing the whole study since 2008,
right.
But when you flash up there site 1, 2, 3,
right.
Are you there for 6 months, or are you there for a year, or because I know trends change within an industry.
Right. So
they may be very busy, and then they may not be very busy.
Right.
And they may be very busy again. So I was just wondering what the time frame was for this.
okay, so the question was in regards to the time frame and the fact that some industry may be more or less busy during certain times of the year, or what's happening for them as an organization. I think so. First, it's this information is based off of the last 2 years. These do not reflect organizations that we are monitoring. It reflects organizations that we have measured. So that the 3-week study, but not consistently going in every 6 months or something of that sort. The idea behind this slide is to create a thought process that individuals are less aware of how often they're actually using their space, and that their numbers, if asked, if you were to do another version of this, is just to ask them how often they use their space, they may not be as aware, or there may be other factors in this. I don't want to waste space, so I'm going to say that I'm using it, 75, 80% of the time, whatever it might be. So I bring up this slide to simply show that when you ask them, those numbers might be different. So the red line to your response, or to your question, the red line indicates the utilization based off of our 3-week study of what has happened, and only during a time when they're actually working and not during a holiday time and all that sort of good stuff. Okay, so for that example, for site 2, they felt like they used their space 86% of the time. In actuality, they only used their utilization was only at 23% of the time. Okay, so the thought process here again is for us to be able to think about how important factual data is, as opposed to sort of this idea of what people think, right, based on just sort of their feeling about an idea. So numbers matter in the discussion. Al?
So we have a delta in that line. You have delivery strategies, you take data as well as your annual
Right.
estimates, and yes, in terms of making decisions.
Right. So based on the question, based on this data, sort of what do you do with this when there's such a large differentiation? So what's important to do is match the quantitative data with qualitative data around focus groups and additional survey work in post to find out what the disconnect is. So you need both types of data to build that conversation, but you need to start at 0, in my opinion, which is the numbers discussion. Okay, then the other challenge that we face with some clients are folks that will tell us that they walk around and do what we call bed checks to see if people they've done their own study and they say, well, we've walked around to see what the utilization is, and we call those bed checks. One client actually has something they call signs of life. So if someone left their cardigan here, or if there was a cup there, or trash in the trash can, those were the 3 signs of life, okay? A cardigan or a jacket, trash in the trash can, or a cup, or some cup, hot cup or coffee mug or something on the desk. If those 3 things were present, they checked that that space was being utilized. Now, that doesn't necessarily help us because we don't know how long they're going to be outside of that particular space, and our goal is to, again, focus on that real estate and to maybe use those dollars in another different way. So these are, again, 4 different clients. They did their bed check work, which is highlighted in red, and then we went in and did our accelerometers, our motes, and determined what their utilization was. So you can always see that the bed checks consistently will be higher than actuality of the seat utilization. And that is based on many different things. The signs of life from one particular customer. Many times it's based on that thought process that I don't want Carol to lose her desk, and so I'm going to mark that Carol was here. And really it's not about any of that. It's really just looking at the real estate of the space. So this is just one thing to sort of keep in mind in that discussion. Now, the idea that we want to get to is at least a conversation around the possibility of shared space, because we know that 60% of the time workstations are going unused. So can we at least have a minor discussion about shared seating in the conversation? So someone then will raise their hand this is what happened at my Collier's conference, and say, what happens if I come to work and there isn't a place for me to sit after we've had this shared space sort of discussion, right? Someone always asks that question. So in the history of doing this sort of research work since 2008, the history of doing this work, that has never, ever happened where all seats were being filled during a study, okay? So this is another real client. I'm going to show you 2 just as an example. This is not always the case, but I'm just showing you the percentage of what's happened with these 2 real clients. This was a study of 375 seats, and you can see here there were always at least, ladies and gentlemen, this is quite concerning, at least 203 seats, or 54% of the seats were empty during the entire 3-week study. Not just a day, but during the entire 3-week study. This should be a compelling case to do something different within the space, and the possibility of just considering a shared sort of work environment in some way or capacity in this discussion. Another client, we measured 161 seats. For them, during the study, at least 33% of the seats were not used throughout the study, okay? Now, I understand it can be different based on industry and time of year and all of those sorts of factors, okay? You can factor in lots of different things in the conversation. But at what point in the case do you want to make a decision based on this snapshot of information to be able to move forth with this? Again, I'm not saying that you take out 33% of the seats or 54% of the seats, but you could do away with some of these and have a different sort of framework for the workplace. Now, we're not getting into how those can be designed. That's all for your great dealer designer folks to sort of put together. But wouldn't it be great to give your dealer designer partners in the back over there, wouldn't it be great to give them real information to do something with? I think that would be wonderful to be able to give them, based on on this data, here's what we can do for you from what we know, okay? So that's sort of my soapbox. Questions, anything so far? Yes, ma'am, and then we'll go over here. Yes, ma'am.
So with the new innovative workplace where a lot of people are using stand-up height desks, do you, for that 3-week period, tell them use your chair, don't stand up?
Okay, very good question, and I get this one too, and I'm sorry I didn't try and answer that already. So because the seat is being measured, in a standing situation, we would not be able to measure their utilization. So one idea would be for them to sit during that time period. Another part of it would be the acknowledgement that we need 2 sets of data, the quantitative information, but then also the qualitative information. So we can go back and through focus groups and surveys ask what type of work they are doing, and that's when they can tell us, you know, X percentage said that they do stand up X percentage of the time, because we want to base that built on, you know, the real work that they're doing. So it may not necessarily be that they need to sit down for that 3-week time period, but you do have to follow it up with additional information, right? Numbers are just one component. If you want to build the biggest case, you need 2 sets of the piece. Is that okay in terms? Yeah? Okay. Yes, ma'am. That's all right? Okay. So you can do it one of 2 ways. I like it. Either one is fine, based on the organization, sort of what they need. All right, so this is a real client. This is not an industry average based on departments. So I want to make that very, very clear. This is a real client, a real snapshot, not an industry average. Many times a client will want to find out what the utilization is within particular departments, okay? This is my argument I'm building towards shared spaces, okay? Or shared work areas. All right, so here's what happens. These are things that everybody in the room already knows. It's just important to have real data to back these numbers up. So for this one real client, okay, they found out that in their sales, recruitment, and leadership area and marketing, folks were not generally using their seats very often. They had a lower, all we need to understand here is that the red bars indicate lower utilization, darker gray bars indicate heavier utilization, okay? We don't need to get into the percentages. Just understand dark bars, heavy users, red bars, lower users. So what we found here is that human resources, finance, and customer support were, for this client, not all clients and with all of these departments, but just this one client, human resources, finance, and customer support were heavy users of their space, okay? So the argument here is that this is against the cookie cutter model, right, of the design programming, right? It is the thought process that not everyone should have the same space. That's okay. It's quite challenging for many people to kind of get on board with that, but this is the case that makes this, okay? So in this one customer example, the space, the physical place for these 3 departments, sales, recruitment, and leadership, we would argue should look very, very, very different from the space utilized by human resources, finance, and customer support. Yes? Does that make sense? Okay? This is quite important for a client. This makes the case against the matrix, that organization, every sort of cube must be this size. This is the reasoning behind it, because human resources, finance, and customer support really need a different type of space because they're using it more often than these other individuals. So I would argue that maybe if your sales team has 12 people, that could you possibly deal with 8 chairs or 9 chairs, 9 spaces for people to do work, because no 12 are ever going to be there at the same time. Then they can just go in a conference room or something if you do have 12 seats there. So the thought process is that can we then harvest the real estate and then do something else different with it based on the way that people are actually working. So if you remember that slide 2 where we were focused on the way that people are really doing work, not the way that we want to fit them in a little box, this is the way that people are really working. Okay? So again, I want to point out again, this is not how every sales department is. This is not how every human resources department is, every finance, every customer support. This is just one client. Okay? Yes, ma'am. This was done by chair. Everything the utilization is in this research is done by the chair study. Okay? All right. So what we can also find is by location what's happening. This is another real client, and you can see here less utilization is indicated in red, heavy utilization is indicated in these darker gray blocks here. So the idea is that the person sitting in this area, this private office, this private office, this private office, it is an argument against I have to have my private office. Could we possibly consider maybe a shared space for some of these red users? And for these gray users, well, they utilize their space quite often, okay? Now, we're not always going to be able to do this, create a shared space for these people that aren't utilizing their private offices, but this at least gives us real numbers, right? So they may say, well, I need to have my private meeting, you know, from time to time. Well, how often is that happening? Well, you know, once every 2 weeks or once every month or whatever it is, right? Yes, Robert.
Was there any behavioral analysis done based on the people you were studying? So, you know, think of Myers-Briggs or DISC assessment and things. Because my personal experience is you've got sort of the chatty Cathy types that are more active, collaborative, and then you have the more introverted types,
right,
which would affect your scoring largely based on the individual, not the work. Was that factored in?
Well, no, it wasn't. But I would argue that people that need to get up and get something done, what we have found will get up and do that 80% of the time in private offices, 60% of the time in a workstation. So this tends to be less about introvert, extrovert, and more about the compelling work that they have to do to sort of get their work done, is my argument. And we can certainly disagree with that. The idea here is that we want to focus again on that real estate, and we can go back and do qualitative discussion around focus groups where we can get more of that understanding of individuals and the work that they're wanting to do. It's not a perfect science, but it's important to sort of base it on some sort of discussion, and so this is beginning to have that conversation, if you will. So one of the other things that we're able to see, oh, this is my only one. So the idea is, again, this is not always going to happen. You know, we're not always going to be able to get to a shared space, but this begins to build that compelling case, okay? So part of this is, again, a continuation of the data that we're able to provide to the client in terms of what's happening. But what you do with all of this is to hopefully lay the groundwork to have a discussion with your dealer designer partners, okay? So using these bits of information, can you then be able to go into programming to calculate those space needs and build a strategy based on those real numbers. And I would argue that we need to build a space based on their business drivers, not necessarily a person. I would argue, just Jesse, that it should be built on the work that needs to be done based on the organization's drivers and not the personality types of individuals. I'm an extreme introvert, but as you can tell, I have to sort of deal with that from time to time, and I think many other folks sort of have to deal with the work that they have to get done, to be finished in the process. So I think that it's important to build that work strategy off of the metrics based on the organizational goals. So one of the things that you can also find out through the data of space utilization are whether or not you have, in general, groups of people that are heavy users or not heavy users of the space. And so this is, again, a real client example, not an industry average, none of that. It's just one snapshot of one client. When we did our study, we were able to find out that the bulk, and this is not always the case, right? But the bulk of these, only 7% were resident workers, but the bulk were either in mobile or flex, we would consider. And those terms, someone might ask, well, how do you come about those terms of mobile, flex, resident? Well, that's what it's based on here. So the utilization of 61 to 100%, we would consider a resident. Utilization of 31 to 60%, of 10 to 30% is around this flex area, and less than 10% is a mobile worker. So I'm a mobile worker in the Dallas showroom, okay? And you can argue those percentages, and that's fine, okay? But at the end of the day, the goal is to sort of build a place, a strategy around this discussion. So you have mobile, resident, flex, or however you want to define them is certainly fine, okay? But we want to know how many people in the space are resident, mobile, flex, or whatever you choose for your terms, so that you can then build a space based on that, and not everybody needs a, 6x6, 5x7 workspace, okay? Because not everybody does. If we find out that there's only 7% resident workers, this makes a big case that the space should be very different for many of these other folks here. Okay, so what you do with this is my one slide in regards to programming, and that's it. So once you find out this information, folks are more resident, mobile, or flex, then you can begin to design with your dealer designer partners what that might look like. So this is an example of what a flex space would be. It has some storage. This back area here, which I know you can't see, is a mobile space. It has no filing and storage here. This is the space that I typically sit in at my showroom in Dallas. And then if you're a resident worker, you're typically in this sort of space, and you see here that it has more work surface for you. It has more filing and storage than a place like this or a place like this here on the other side. I know that that's a very big sort of idea. It's not very specific in the approach, but it's the thought of building the strategy based on this. Then you need to give that to your A&D professionals, to your dealer designer partner, to then use that data to make a great space. Yes? Okay? Yeah? Okay. So this is, again, another real client, numbers provided by the financial numbers provided by the real client. This is not an industry average or an average over since 2008. This is just one snapshot that I'm showing you. So I started with the dollars at the end of this conversation. I'm starting it with it or ending with it here in this sort of process. So for this organization here, you see over 2,100 seats were measured in this study. They determined, not us, this cost within the square footage, and they determined that their opportunity of underutilized space was at $1.23 million. So for them, this thought was that it could fund 498 workstations. Okay, and I don't want to get into the weeds again about all the cost of a workstation and this and that, but I just want to show you how they determined the cost would be for them. Now, I'm not necessarily saying if their utilization, if their overall utilization was at 14%, maybe they should not be buying 498 workstations, okay? So think about that. But what I am thinking about is what they could do with that $1.23 million, okay? Again, maybe it's in R&D, maybe it's in technology, whatever it might be, but allowing them to determine what that value is of areas that aren't being utilized, and then be able to build a case around those dollars, okay? It's very, 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 very important that the client for us comes up with those real estate numbers, not us, but how they want to define it based on their needs.